Hello everyone. My talk today is based on Mark 7, 1 to 13. Again, I'm reading today from my own very literal translation of the Greek text. You might want to read along with your own version and note the differences. Again, I recommend the ESV, the English Standard Version, as a more literal translation that you can buy or read online for free. Mark 7. And the Pharisees gathered to him, and some of the scribes who came from Jerusalem. And they saw some of his disciples eating bread with defiled hands, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, according to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, they do not eat if they do not wash, and there are many other things that they have received that they do, such as the washing of cups and vessels and utensils and couches for dining. And the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed, defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Isaiah rightly prophesies concerning you hypocrites, as it has been written, this people honour me with their lips, but their heart far away is kept from me. In vain they now worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Having neglected the commandments of God, you hold to the tradition of men with the washing of vessels and cups and similar things as much as you do." And he was saying to them neatly, "You set aside the commandment of God, that your tradition you might keep. For Moses said, 'Honour your father and your mother,' and the one speaking evil of his father and mother must be put to death. You, however, say that if a man tells his father or mother, 'Whatever gift you would have been given from me, that you would have profited from, is korban,' meaning given to God, then you do not allow him to do anything for his father and mother, making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many similar things that you do." The message of this passage is in one sense very simple. The Pharisees and scribes were criticizing the disciples of Jesus for not following their tradition of washing their hands before eating. Their practice of washing hands, cooking and eating utensils and dining couches was virtually obsessive-compulsive. It was not required by the law, but these traditions, really additions to the law, were practiced as if they were the law. At the same time, as Jesus makes clear to them, they have a form of religion, worshipping God with words, but not worshipping God with their hearts. Instead, says Jesus, you have replaced the commands of God with your traditions. And he gives an example by addressing the commandment, "Honour your father and mother." Jesus accuses them of getting out of this commandment by saying, "Any gift of money or help I could have given to my father or mother is korban," a term meaning given to God. So these religious Jews were not caring for their parents, but following their tradition, in practice ignoring the law. This passage, I suppose, ought to raise questions about things we might do that are not required by God, but are acts of empty religious tradition. All sorts of churches do things that are not required by God. I won't go into detail here. Perhaps you need to question your own religious practices, as I do mine. Now, having said that, I think this is an extremely important passage, which, along with other teaching in Mark, contributes to my estimation of the period in which this gospel was written, especially when we compare it to Matthew and Luke. Now, it has to be said, this is a very subtle business. Please bear with me as I go through my reasoning. Any student of the gospel knows that Mark, Matthew, and Luke have very similar, if not identical, passages in common. All you have to do is look at a synopsis of the Gospels that I've mentioned already in this series. in my comments on Mark 2:13 to 17. It's obvious that John has a very different structure to Matthew, Mark and Luke, and indeed concentrates on some very different and specific teaching to the other three Gospels. The first three Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The term synopsis is a Greek term that means seeing together. You can place them side by side and compare them. Most scholars have concluded that Matthew, Mark and Luke have some sort of literary relationship. Many Christians, particularly Roman Catholics, basing their thinking on the teaching of the early church fathers, have said that Matthew was the first gospel and Mark must have edited his gospel for a more Gentile audience. And then Luke used Mark and Matthew in the composition of his gospel. However, the majority of scholars today take the line that Mark was the first Greek gospel, and Matthew and then Luke must then have had some version of Mark in front of them as they wrote their gospels. So the majority academic view of the first three gospels is that Mark was first, followed by Matthew in Greek, and then by Luke. I do agree, based on the teaching of the early church fathers, that Matthew wrote a gospel in the Hebrew tongue, that is Aramaic, before the Greek gospels were written. Now, when it comes to dating the Gospels, as I've said already, the majority of critical scholars date Mark at somewhere between 65 to 80 CE, and the other Gospels later than that. One popular scholar I've seen dates Mark somewhere between 67 and 73 CE, basing the date on the account of the prophecy of Jesus that the temple would be destroyed, recorded in Mark 13. She says scholars who think this was a prophecy of Jesus date the gospel before the event, while others take the line that the gospel was written after the destruction of the temple, which implies that Jesus did not actually prophesy the destruction. It was added by Mark to make Jesus appear to have prophesied it. In other words, a lie. The scholar concerned, edging her bets, doesn't tell us which position she takes on this important issue. She says that scholars who don't believe in the miraculous, and that includes prophecy, tend to date Mark after the destruction of the temple. Going along with the argument of the post-70 scholars makes Mark, or whoever wrote the Gospel, appear to be a fabricator. I mean, we must ask, if Mark 13 was written after the event, what other additions did the author make? No wonder skeptical scholars, for example, so-called distinguished American scholar Bart Ehrman, can write damaging books like his book Forged, in which he claims none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry or based on the teaching of eyewitnesses. Counter to this, I would like to say that our dating of Mark should be based on when we date the other Gospels. The dating of John apart, and if Luke was the third Gospel, we might ask, when was Luke written? Now, Luke's Gospel was written to someone he calls most excellent Theophilus, Luke 1 verse 3. Theophilus means literally friend or lover of God. This could have been a specific person or just a general term for the sort of people who might read his Gospel, lovers of God. In reading Acts chapter 1, it's quite clear that Acts is a sequel to Luke, written to the same person or sort of person. As Acts 1 verse 1 says, "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach." When it comes to dating Luke, we ought to ask, when was Acts written? Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. There is no mention of his death, somewhere around 62 to 64 CE, or the death of Peter, probably at the beginning of the persecution of Christians in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero in about 64 CE. Neither does the book of Acts mention the death of James, the brother of Jesus, leader of the church in Jerusalem, which most likely took place in 61 or 62 CE, although some say he lived until 69 CE. But if Acts was written much later in the first century, as those who want to date the Gospel late often say, why no mention of the martyrdom of three of the key leaders of the early church? So I believe that Acts was most likely written at the latest by 64 CE or indeed earlier. Given it was a sequel to Luke, Luke is likely to have been written a year or two before, so 60 to 62 CE. If we follow the order accepted by the majority of scholars, Matthew would have been written earlier and Mark even earlier. But how much earlier? Although in our passage today Jesus condemns additions to the law by religious leaders of his time, a careful reading of the first three Gospels reveals that Jesus was a careful keeper of the law. Mark writes, expecting his readers to know certain background information because they are all keepers of the law themselves. Matthew and Luke, writing later, add more detail for the sake of the Gentiles who were becoming Christians and were not keepers of the law and especially the food laws. They adjust some of their passages where Jesus engages with the law that they more or less copy from Mark. So their readers will not conclude wrongly that Jesus broke the law and encouraged others to do so. As I've said earlier in the introduction to this series of talks, if what I say here is true, Mark was most likely composed before Christians started disagreeing about whether they should strictly keep the Old Testament law or not, which took place somewhere between 35 and 45 CE. Why do I think this? Well, because a read-through of the Synoptic Gospel shows that Jesus strictly kept to the actual law. Jesus wore the fringe required by the law for Jewish men on his clothes. Numbers 15 verses 37 to 41 tells us that Jews were to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner as a reminder that they were God's people called to keep his commandments. When Jesus healed the leper in Mark 1, verses 40 to 45, he told him to go and show himself to the priest as required by the law. In Mark 10, verses 17 to 27, we shall see that Jesus points the rich young ruler to the Ten Commandments, and when answering a question about the greatest commandment in Mark 12, verses 28 to 31, Jesus quotes directly from the law from Deuteronomy 6. As I've said, a number of passages in Mark indicate a strict adherence to the Jewish law by Jesus, and their parallel passages in Matthew and Luke have slight subtle adjustments and explanations that need to be made for the sake of Gentile Christians and those not aware of the nuances of the Jewish law. I will point to just three as examples. First, Mark 2, verses 23 to 28, about the disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath as they walked along. Since the disciples were only plucking and not harvesting, they were not breaking any Old Testament law. You see, Deuteronomy 23, verse 25 allows this practice. And I quote, "If you go into your neighbour's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbour's standing grain." The Pharisees, looking on, wanted to catch the disciples out. They might have wanted to suggest the disciples were preparing food against the law on the Sabbath. Jesus points out to them that the law of the Sabbath was for people's benefit, not to harm them. Law-keeping Christians in the early church would have known all of that. Matthew uses this story, but in Matthew 12 verse 1 he makes a small but significant clarification. He points out that the disciples were plucking the grain to eat, not harvesting, clarifying that they were not breaking the law. Luke 6 verse 1 says, the disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. Luke makes it very clear that the disciples were not harvesting to take the grain away, they were eating it there and then, and were therefore not doing anything against the law. You see, the earliest Christians would have known without being told that no Old Testament law was being broken, even without the words added by Matthew and Luke for clarification. The second passage I want to point to is Mark 10, verses 2 to 12. Those who did not know about the Jewish laws permitting divorce, this passage sounds like Jesus is making a blanket prohibition of divorce to them. Any law-keeping Christian in the earliest church would have known that wasn't the case. Matthew clarifies this by adding the words except for sexual immorality, and Luke avoids it by saying only that remarried partners commit adultery. Mark didn't need these additions because his audience knew that the Jewish law and certainly Jewish practice condoned and practically demanded divorce in the case of sexual infidelity, so would automatically add that in their minds to Jesus' saying. The conclusion from the grain picking and question of divorce passages that they both show that Mark is able to assume what others could not, because his readers were all law keepers, very much aware of the intricacies of the law. Lastly, our passage today and the next passage I'm teaching on, in total Mark 7, 1 to 23, in the second part of this passage, which we will have fully addressed next time, Jesus declares all foods clean. Jesus is only countering the traditional view that eating with unwashed hands makes food unclean. Since Jesus in Mark is seen to keep the law, all foods would mean all foods permitted in the law. Mark can only say it in this way because he knows his readers will assume this. Jesus has just criticised the Pharisees for breaking the law about caring for parents, so he would not be advocating law-breaking. Matthew omits the phrase making all foods unclean because he knows that his readers will take it to mean all in an absolute sense as justification for abandoning food laws. He would not have wanted that, being a law-keeper himself. As an aside, this suggests Matthew was probably written before people became aware of Peter's vision in Acts verse 10 that would have occurred in about 40 CE. Luke, notwithstanding the intricacies of the Jewish regulations discussed, omits this entire incident or the criticism of the practices of the disciples by the Pharisees from his gospel. So I conclude it is very likely that Mark was written 35 to 40 CE, and Matthew in Greek probably 5 to 10 years later, and Luke after that somewhere in the early 50s CE. So my conclusion is the Gospels, being far from late, are very early documents that communicate to us the teaching and practice of Jesus as observed by the earliest eyewitnesses. They are therefore totally reliable. See you next time.